Hi, everyone, and welcome to the special simulcast of the Neil Haley Show and Growing Older with Enthusiasm with our host, Dr. Ron Kaiser. Dr. Ron, how are you? And we really have gotten a lot of resources so far for people, for the older populations looking to grow with enthusiasm from some of the people we've highlighted the last couple of weeks, from financial people to keep staying organized to people like that have leisure activities, right? We're finding a lot of different aspects for the older population to grab from your podcast.
Yeah, it's been really rewarding to be able to spread the word about so many meaningful things out to this population. So
All
it's
right.
really looking forward to another
All right.
conversation
So I'm
today.
excited to welcome the program Dr. Mary Canty Merrill. I know her very well from our podcast that we co host together, but ultimately, Dr. Mary helps people through all types of losses. And today we're going to talk more about loss of a loved one, but we can get into other types of loss that the older population deals with. Because, right, Dr. Mary, everyone hears about loss and hears life after loss, and they say, oh, that only has to deal with only a loss of
Death,
a loved one, but it's not, right?
right. And loss it's multifaceted. I mean, there are so many different kinds of losses and loss of identity, loss of innocence, loss of community, loss of belonging, a sense of belonging, loss of your independence, loss of course, of a significant other, a spouse, a person you love, or even loss of a pet. So there are many different kinds of losses. And loss, I always say, is something that impacts you negatively in a spiritual way, a psychological way, a physical way. And so, yeah, emotion, and even emotionally.
Well, it sounds like, loss can be impacting at almost any age range, because when we define loss that way, people can lose jobs, can lose others in their environment, and so on. But I'm sure it hits the older age range uh,
Hmm.
much more so, and perhaps more closely if it's loss of a spouse or a loved one. Um, so I guess I'm wondering, just in general, where do you come in? Is it there's something that can be done preventively? Do people not face it and they come seeking help when the loss has occurred? How do we deal with loss as a population?
Well, I think the biggest thing is actually accepting, first and foremost, that loss is a natural part of the life cycle. Of whether it's not a matter of if we're going to experience loss, it's when. And so loss is a natural part of the life cycle, and grief is a natural response to loss. And so, first and foremost, it's just really coming to terms with acceptance. Once we've gotten to the point of acceptance, then we're able to better deal with whatever that loss is.
Well, acceptance is one of those words that I think everybody uses, and everybody kind of assumes that other people are using it in the same way. When it comes to loss, how do you kind of define acceptance so that it's a healthy process?
Yeah, it really is coming to terms with recognizing or even accepting that the loss has happened to you. And it is really not something that has happened to you as much as it could be something that's happened for you. Because there's a saying that not all storms come to disrupt our path, to disrupt our lives, but they come to clear our path. And so sometimes with with acceptance, I'm speaking of acceptance in terms of not being in denial regarding whatever that loss is,
Okay,
coming to terms with it.
that's helpful. Does it matter whether the loss is something you can prepare for, or again, whether there's a sudden death, or even, that nowadays people are getting laid off from jobs without having seen it coming, which
Mhm.
obviously is a loss, or uh, is is there a difference in the way that people cope, and the way that they should cope, whether we're dealing with a sudden loss or one that you can prepare for?
You know, people handle grief very differently. They handle their losses differently. Some losses, true enough, are sudden, they're unexpected. And even when a loss is anticipated, it still does not, it still can have shock value, and it can create all kinds of feelings and emotions, because some people, even though they know the loss is coming, it is still an unsettling and an unpleasant experience. And so in terms of preparation, I think really it depends on the individual, because everybody is very different. Some people can you know, roll with will go with the flow, if you will. Some people can deal with the loss in terms of it coming and how it's impacting their life. And then there are other people that it's really going to debilitate them. So it depends on the individual in terms of preparation, because there's no one size that fits all.
And let me ask from the perspective of someone who is kind of an observer or friend to someone who's experiencing a loss. I think one of the more difficult things to do is be put in that situation and not know how to react. I mean, I think we see this with respect to divorce, where
Mhm,
we may have been friends with both uh, parts of the couple.
mhm.
We see it with respect to death or job loss, or loss of community. If somebody's forced into a move, loss of health issues. Um,
Mhm.
is there a general principle for the observer? Is there something we look to the other person for a cue, or is it something that we try and encourage as much normality in our relationship, or do we not say anything till they say something, or how do we? Because again, I know it's not nearly as difficult to experience it as an observer as the person who's actually experiencing the loss, but still, it's a very uncomfortable place to be.
It is. You know, one of the things that I think is helpful is that, especially in the case of the elderly, they're already experiencing so many different kinds of losses, and independence, loss of community, it could be loss of financial status, and loss of mobility, loss in other kinds of physical challenges. And so sometimes it will be helpful, if we're speaking especially in terms of the elderly, but it doesn't have to just be the elderly. You can ask the observer, how am I, do you perceive me coping with this loss? Because sometimes we don't really know how, or we're not even in tune with what we're feeling and the emotions that we are experiencing. So sometimes it is helpful for the person who is grieving to ask someone, how do you think I'm grieving, how do you think I'm doing, just to get that additional perspective.
And and when you get that additional perspective, do you go for additional help once you figure that out? Once the people around you kind of explain what they're seeing from you?
Yeah,
Right.
you do. You actually, when you find out and get some insight, gain insight about what is going on with you, you will want to think about, what can I do for me? One of the things I recommend is to take time, all the time that you need, because there is no time frame for grief. Our society expects people to, if you've had a loss, especially a loss of a loved one or a pet, if you will, we're back in the workplace in 3 days and moving on with life as if nothing has happened. So you're essentially asking that person to cut off a limb or leave a part of themselves behind. So once you get information about how you're being perceived, and you don't even have to necessarily, you can ask more than one person, because the knowledge, that information can be helpful in terms of you knowing, how do I proceed? What are the things that I need to do? Some people may need to go through grief counseling. Some people can deal with it through their communities of faith. Some people can go join a support group. So it really does depend on the individual. and what approach they feel is going to be appropriate for their particular situation.
Well, when we talk about extreme loss, death, or that, say, a loved one has a medical condition that's not going to make them return to normal. Um, when we're dealing with that kind of extreme loss, how do we know when it's time to get help, or how do we know if, hey, what we're going through is kind of a normal process, give myself some time, are there some guidelines for what healthy grieving and less healthy grieving might be?
Mhm. Well, let me take it from the perspective of the healthy grieving, and then it'll kind of, I think that will, if we emphasize the healthy grieving, when a person has reached a particular age, especially in the elderly phases, they're already dealing with other kinds of losses, and then they're probably dealing with even multiple deaths. So one of the things that would be helpful is to just keep a pulse on that individual in terms of how they're doing. And especially if you're a caretaker and you have been around them and you know their personality and you know how they generally are, behaving, and how life is, how they're adapting or not adapting to things. So it's allowing them, encouraging them to talk about the loss, helping them, if they've lost multiple people, talk individually, talk about each person individually, because that can help take away some of that feeling of overwhelm. Another thing is for them to reinforce healthy behaviors, abstain from alcohol and anything other than whatever medications the doctor has prescribed, because a lot of times people will use substances and substitutes to numb their feelings. And so it really is giving them an opportunity, to the extent that they're able to exercise or get any kind of physical activity. They might not have the same mobility, but they can perhaps do a little bit of something. And allowing them to have an opportunity to socialize, that can be helpful as well, whether that's with a faith community, whether it's with some friends, whether it is with a group, a support group of any kind. So it's, those are the kinds of things that can help it'll help the person, the caretaker, to gauge that individual's, to gauge their behaviors, to see how they're adapting. And if you spend time with the person enough in terms of taking care of them or being their caretaker, you'll have some clues about whether or not it's depression or anxiety or any of the other kinds of emotional feelings, as opposed to if it's something that is a normal reaction to how they typically respond to things. Because I know, for example, in terms of my father, for instance, my dad really never showed a lot of emotion. So we had to be able to determine, we actually asked him, are you depressed? And he didn't really know that he was depressed. So, we took him to his physician, and the physician was able to do some, diagnostics and determine that he was suffering from some depression. And that's, a lot of that comes from the different kinds of losses and losing your youth, losing your mobility. All of this stuff is it's very hard, and it can compound the grief process. So it really is finding out, getting to know the person enough to find out and if you can't do that, take them to a professional that can help and provide some direction and insight.
Yeah, and when you're seeing specifically enough the suffering they're going through for that loss, and they have lack of mobility, different things, finding friends is very, very important, Dr. Mary, to find people to communicate with, but also if you know of someone older that's lost the important part of their lives, to be there for them, to really try to help them through this and find the right resources.
And the biggest thing, I don't want to mean to cut you off, but it's not imposing what we think is, the myths that we've embraced by society. A lot of times people have, people grieve the same way, people grieve for the same amount of time. It is not, we don't want to impose what we think is the appropriate way to grieve, because there really is no right or wrong way to grieve.
Yeah, that's very helpful information. And I think from what I'm hearing throughout, it's probably goes back to one of the first things that you said, that if we acknowledge that loss is a normal part of life, even though it's not, anything we particularly look forward to, that it's a normal part of life, then what we want to be able to do, if although the situation has changed,
Mhm.
is to, I hate to use the word normalize, but kind of normalize things as much as possible to get them back to a normal eating pattern, exercise,
Mhm.
activities, socialization. And I know it's the furthest thing from some people's mind when
It
they're
is.
experiencing certain losses, but that seems like a real important thing.
And
Um,
a lot of times too, people, it's easy for people to withdraw when they are feeling the deep sense, when they're grieving. You don't, a lot of people don't really want to be around anybody else. They want to just be left alone. And that is, the isolation is probably one of the most unhealthy things that we can allow them to continue being alone. So encouraging socializing. It doesn't have to be a lot. It could just be a few minutes a day, or different times throughout the day, giving them that opportunity to just connect with you or connect with someone, that takes away that feeling of loneliness.
well, listeners have heard me many times talk about the importance of social connectedness, that loneliness is a killer when you get into the older age ranges. So it's
Mhm.
important to not compound that loss. There's been so much enlightening information that you've presented, Doctor. I wonder how listeners could, what resources you have, and how listeners can get in touch with some of the things that you have to offer and learn more about it than they can in a short podcast.
Yeah, actually they can go to my website, www.marycanty, Canty, Merrill, MERRILL.com. And so that's www.marycantymerrill.com. And if just they can reach out to connect with me, and I'm more than happy to provide resources and additional information for anybody who has, an interest in knowing.
Well, this has been wonderful. I mean, it's a topic that uh, people avoid too much,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm proud that we're not avoiding it here. So I think you've exhausted my questions. Really will be following up to see what you have on your website. But Neil, anything from your end?
No, no, not at all. I think that what Dr. Mary is able to bring to the table is that just when you lose a loved one or any type of loss, even in the older adult community, you got to ask for help first
Mm-hmm.
by talking to your people around you, and then finding a professional like Dr. Mary or somebody else that can kind of really go through and help them through this process, because it's all about processing things. And both of you guys are psychologists, so you understand that completely. If you don't process things and have conversations and have somebody to listen to through that,
Mm-hmm.
forget about it.
That's right.
Never works out for sure.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Absolutely.
All right. Appreciate it. All right. That
Mhm.
was Growing Older with Enthusiasm, guys. Take care.